Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event, The Future of Online Trust and Safety with TSPA and DTSP. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Adeline Tsai, a co-founder of the Trust and Safety Professional Association, or TSPA. If you're not familiar with us, the goal of the Trust and Safety Professional Association is to advance the global trust and safety profession through a shared community of practice. We do this by connecting folks through a network of peers, supporting them through finding resources for career development and exchanging best practices for navigating challenges unique to the profession. Today, at this event, you'll be hearing from experts on two different panels. Our first panel is called Building a Trust and Safety Team, which we will kick off in a few moments. The second one is Planning for the Next Global Crisis, Trust and Safety Lessons Learned from COVID-19, which David will be moderating. And now I'm going to hand it over to David to introduce himself as well as DTSP.
Thank you, Adeline. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us today. Welcome on behalf of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. So the DTSP, if you are not familiar with us, is a first of its kind initiative of a growing group of tech companies to develop industry best practices reviewed through internal and independent assessments to ensure that digital services are being used in a safe and trustworthy manner. So put simply, the TSPA is bringing together the professionals working in the trust and safety field, while the DTSP is bringing together the platforms and providers of digital services. So we're delighted to be working together to organize this event and hopefully many future collaborations. So I'm looking forward to moderating the second session in about an hour, where we're going to be talking to experts who are working with technology companies on issues ranging from child protection to countering terrorism and working to combat disinformation online. But now I'll hand things back over to Adeline to kick off the first panel. Thanks.
Remember, you'll want to stay tuned after this first panel ends because we'll be queuing up the second one. Recordings will be available afterwards as well. And now I'd love to introduce our three panelists for the day. Sev Guardado, who is the Global Head of Trust and Safety Operations at Pinterest, Lindsay Silvern, the Director of Trust and Safety at Discord, and Caitlin Sullivan, the Director of Content Policy at Facebook. So I think maybe to kick things off, because some people might be new to you, I was wondering if in the order that I introduced you all in, if you could, again, introduce yourselves, share your personal pronouns, and also explain a little bit about what you do and kind of, in a very, very short kind of 2-sentence way, explain the sort of work that you do on a day-to-day basis. I know that's really hard, but we'll get into the details in a little bit. So I'll have follow-on questions. So let's start with Sev and then go to Lindsay and then go to Caitlin.
All right, well, I'll take a crack at it. In 2 sentences, my name is Sev, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Global Head of Trust and Safety Operations at Pinterest. At Pinterest, my team focuses on things like content safety, content moderation, as well as things around, I would characterize as data protection, so intellectual property, law enforcement and government requests for data, as well as privacy. 2 sentences.
Great job.
Sweet. Hi, my name is Lindsay. My pronouns are they, them. And in my day-to-day, I manage the operations and enforcement side of trust and safety at Discord. So all the trust and safety inquiries that come in reactively from users, plus a number of sub-teams directed at specific abuse verticals that we want to get rid of.
And I'm Caitlin, she, hers. I work on content policy at Facebook. We are, in short, the team that gets to write all of the rules for what's allowed and not allowed across our platforms and what we do when someone breaks those rules. We work really closely with our operations and our product partners as well to make sure those rules go from things on a piece of paper to something making a meaningful difference to our community of about 3 billion people.
Excellent. And so kind of my next question is, did you all think that you would actually be ending up doing this work? I mean, it's not the kind of thing where, at like age 5, right? Like some kids are like, oh, I'm going to be an astronaut. I don't think any kids kind of think to themselves like, oh, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to work in trust and safety. So I was wondering if you could maybe individually share a little bit about, how you came to the jobs that you have now and like the roles that you have now and how you managed to kind of stay in these roles, because as we all know, like there are a lot of challenges to doing this work. And I was hoping that we could maybe start with Caitlin and then go to Lindsay and then go to Sev.
Yeah, definitely did not grow up thinking I would do this sort of work. I actually started at Facebook as an intern on our public policy, so kind of lobbying team when I was in graduate school, and slowly got pulled into a few issues in the trust and safety space. We were a much smaller company then, a much smaller team, and one of my coworkers had a just small project for me about hate speech against women online. And that, of course, side project, just little thing to do with 10% of your time, solve that. And so that snowballed, and I really realized how much I enjoyed the work, both the kind of philosophy behind it. I was a political theory major in college, total, nerd about governance and setting up communities and buy-in and rules and fairness. And then seeing it evolve over the years as well. I've been at Facebook for almost 9 years now, but my job has not been the same throughout that time. Our platform has not been the same. The issues facing trust and safety have not been the same. And I think that's really what keeps it fun and interesting. And personally, I've been really interested in going from a focus on kind of what the rules are to how we implement them as the technology in the trust and safety space has improved so dramatically over time. So fell into it sideways, not a career path for many people to follow in terms of getting started. It's so much different now. I think my parents finally know what I do. I don't think they did for the first 5 years or so. But have really enjoyed this space.
I love hearing these stories. It's just so fun always. Because like this job didn't exist so recently, and it's still developing, and that's part of what's so exciting about it. I also fell into it kind of by accident. I thought I would go to law school. So I was gonna work in nonprofit, but the place that wanted to hire me when I was applying for jobs was Dropbox. And so I started out working on their law enforcement response team. And I was planning on studying for the LSAT, and I didn't. I turned out that I kind of did not enjoy the antagonistic parts of that job, which was a pretty good sign to me that I wasn't going to be a lawyer. And at the same time, I was seeing all of this amazing technical stuff happen at a tech company. And so instead of studying for the LSAT, I was doing other nerdy, fun stuff and wound up changing teams and working on automated abuse there. And so that was a lot of fun. And then I had a friend, a former coworker who had come to Discord, and I was like, what is Discord? You're gonna go work at a company with a name Discord? And then some months after Charlottesville, after a lot of conversations where I poked fun at this friend, and he finally persuaded me that I should give this a shot, and I wanted to ban some white supremacists. So I hopped over to Discord, and I've been here now for almost 4 years, and worn a lot of different hats in that time, gotten to work on a lot of different abuse problems, and it's been a blast that no one could have predicted. So very lucky.
Yeah, totally agree with Lindsay that I love hearing people's stories and how they tell them how they made their way into the work and stuff like that. I got into trust and safety work, or what I tell people is what would eventually be called trust and safety work, because like you said, Lindsay, this concept of a career didn't really exist. But I got into it about 11 years ago. And truth be told, the economy crashed, I needed a job. And so like a lot of folks who make their way into trust and safety work, I started getting in the door just by doing like frontline user support work. I quickly discerned that like, that's the type of job that like, there's only a certain amount of growth that like you can get like logging people back into their accounts. And so I was a counselor in college, and that was really meaningful to me. And this was at Facebook at the time, and figured that like, the team that works on suicide prevention, child safety was more aligned with what would be super meaningful for me and like in my background. So I applied, got it. And from there, again, like a classic, I think, trust and safety story is like you find where your niche is, like what you're good at. So I made my way into investigations and tooling, and then got the itch to go into analytics, where I spent several years there building out an analytics team. And so it's been really great to see all like Caitlin was saying, like how it's evolved over time and how we can get better at doing it. And I think you get the question a lot of like, you've been in it so long, how can you do it? I think Adeline, you'd ask like, how do you do it for so long? For me, it comes down to like 3 questions that I ask myself about every year, sometimes more often depending on how things are going. But is this work meaningful? Is it challenging to me? And do I love the people that I'm working with? And thankfully, that's been true for me the entire time. So I keep, what I tell people is I keep choosing this work. And so that's what, keeps me in it for this long, keeps me going. And I made the transition from Facebook over to Pinterest fairly recently, about 5 months ago. And, great experiences in both places.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your kind of pathways into trust and safety. It's always very, like everyone said, like it's always very interesting to hear how people got here, because in some ways our profession is just starting to get a lot of public attention, and it's not something that you have a core curriculum for, although TSPA is kind of working on that, but it's still developing as a more formalized practice, even though people have been engaging in the work for so long. One of the things that I picked up, and I'd love for actually like the 3 of you to interact a lot more too, because I like panels where the panelists like really interact and the moderator isn't just like rapid fire questioning. But one of the themes that I picked up from the 3 of you was that trust and safety is evolving, right, as a practice. And you started out doing one thing, and then you learned about another aspect. So I'm kind of curious, because there are generalizations of what trust and safety is. And in your experience, and the 3 of you are all very accomplished in this field, what does the field of trust and safety really mean to you? And if you had to distill a definition of trust and safety, and everyone has kind of a different definition, we kind of struggled that with TSPA when we were setting it up, trying to describe trust and safety, but what does that really mean to you? And anyone can jump in. Don't have to be polite.
I can take a crack at it. So I, like you alluded to, Adeline, I think different companies have like drawn the umbrella differently. That's certainly, what I've observed in talking to a bunch of folks. I personally think that trust and safety is the work that keeps a website or a platform, whatever it is that you're building, safe and welcoming. So people, people want to spend time in a place, in an online space or wherever it is, without worries of having a bad experience or being exposed to things that are risky or upsetting, that sort of stuff. The way that I sort of, draw the line between that and like what your company's doing is like the mission. So like, what is the mission of your company or your platform, whatever it is, and how does trust and safety work enable that? So at Pinterest, like we want to be a place for inspiration. That means we're super deliberate about creating a safe and positive space for our users. And so you'll see like the policy and the enforcement and things like map to that, and things that are related and support that, we kind of like pull into our umbrella. So that's generally how I think about it, with the caveat that different companies are organized in different ways and like they, light up the switchboard differently. But that's just how I think about it broadly when somebody says like trust and safety.
Yeah, and I really like Sev's point there too, that what trust and safety means anywhere is going to be informed by the mission of the company, of the platform, of the service. I think part of trust and safety is making that mission a reality for the community or enabling that mission. And you'll see that's why probably each of us use some different words when we talk about it and some different framings, because our platforms do different things. And so what it means to enable those missions and make those communities accessible to as many people as possible is going to look different on our platforms. Facebook's mission isn't about inspiration and positivity necessarily. It's about enabling people to form communities that are meaningful to them. Some of those are, about really serious issues or darker issues or other issues. And so we're going to have a slight twist. And that's not all that far from kind of Pinterest's mission, but it's going to be the lens by which each company views kind of trust and safety, and I think answers that question. But at its core, I agree with Sev, it's about making the platforms or the company or the space kind of as safe as possible to enable the mission.
Yep. Well, before anyone had talked, I was thinking those gears were totally turning for me too. So that's dope. I guess I would say that, like, in the making the case for trust and safety sort of adjacent area, aside from just being the right thing to do, to be accountable to your users and like what your product is and like what that mission is in the world, it's also a brand issue. It's a growth and retention issue. The same way that a user might not choose your product if it doesn't have like a key feature that they want, they also might not choose your product if it's got a reputation for being a place where child pornographers hang out. So this is direct support for your product being able to accomplish what it's there to do and not being derailed by like the most toxic parts of humanity. And again, it really is just the right thing to do.
And I think that's really important too, because sometimes I think folks external to the industry question a little bit sometimes how incentivized companies are to invest a lot in trust and safety. If it's kind of like just the right thing to do, would a company just do a bare minimum, treat it like a compliance issue? But I think Lindsay really hit the nail on the head when they said it enables your growth as well, and it's a value add, and it's often very kind of in line with what the company would want to do anyway, and kind of in line with other goals of a company. One of the things we talk about too is kind of the false framing sometimes of like expression versus safety. You can either allow people to say a lot of things or keep them safe. Well, people won't say things or join your community or express themselves unless they feel safe. These things are, I think, a little bit less intention and a lot more cohesive than it sometimes looks like from the outside.
I think Caitlin,
yeah, I like that point, and I think sorry, Ellen. The last thing I'd add on top of that is like, I think that didn't all happen by accident, and it's very different from when I think a lot of us got started in this field, and like where we've ended up, where like companies get it or they realize. And I think there's a lot of, in some cases, like companies have gone through, the gauntlet to like start to realize, hey, this is really important. In other cases, there's people who are tuning in right now who are like in the work and like doing the advocacy and like building the case and that sort of stuff. So I think that just sort of highlights the importance of professionals in this space who like have to articulate, all right, this is what's going on and this is why it matters to like the company, the product, in addition to like what Lindsay, you were saying, like this is also like the right thing to do, but in case that's not compelling enough for you, this is super important across all dimensions.
Yeah, I feel like the three of you have set me up for a really nice segue into this other question, which is, which is very convenient for me. But the three of you have, very broad range of kind of insight into different types of companies, right? And different sizes, different types of scale of companies. And, we're talking about like, hey, like it's the right thing to do, like it really contributes to growth, and some companies get it, some companies don't. If I were a startup founder, which I am not, and I was sitting here with, my new shiny fancy platform that's going to, connect people or, make communication easier or, make people's lives better, right? And I'm sitting here and I'm hearing you talk and I'm kind of panicking, right? Because, oh no, I have like 3 full-time employees. in a year, I might have 100. And in 5 years, I may have 100. Like, when do I actually start investing in trust and safety? Because I just don't have the resources, right? And that's a difficult call for any startup founder, because they're trying to balance all of these different obligations and needs. They might not be an expert themselves in what online safety really is. What kind of advice would you give to a startup founder who's sitting here, maybe watching this right now and being like, uh-oh, like, I really got to start thinking about this?
So one thing that I know to be true about startups in general is that everyone has to wear all the different hats. And I think that trust and safety is now in this really wonderful place where there are, thanks in part to the TSPA, a lot more developing resources that you can share with your existing employees to help grow their skill set to include some aspects of trust and safety work. And I think that that's actually how I've heard about a lot of trust and safety professionals at really early stage startups getting started. Is I was working in customer support and we started to get this kind of ticket, but I'd actually encourage startups to expand that beyond customer support and user facing functions, because that's like a pretty reactive place to be. If like the first you're hearing about abuse on your platform is via users bringing it to your attention. I mean, like, please listen to your users when they're experiencing it, but there are actually more preventative places where you can start to develop your people to think about this stuff. You can have your product designers and product managers learn about how to design products safely, to empower users to take their own actions, and potentially even like educational resources you can offer to your users. Those are all things that you can try to slot into your already probably very overflowing roadmap to try to get the foundations of trust and safety, I guess, ethos in what you're building to build safely for the exciting path you're on, where of course your product's going to explode in popularity and you're going to need to get a team of hundreds of trust and safety people. But yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, which is, yeah, if you've got anyone thinking about user experience or customer support, they should already be thinking about trust and safety, even if they're not calling it that. So when you're designing, I love our design teams at Facebook. I think they're like really great natural partners for trust and safety, because they're thinking, how will a person experience this? And I think sometimes the startup or the Silicon Valley bubble were maybe a little bit optimistic, kind of how will they use this well and correctly and in exciting ways. But if you just start to broaden your minds of how might someone misuse this or experience harm through this, as Lindsay said, like, boom, you're already thinking trust and safety. You're already thinking upstream about how do I change the product to minimize the likelihood that I need to build a large reactive staff? How do I get people resources? How do I get ahead of things? But just to start, kind of every view of your product is both how will people use this the way I designed it to be used, but also how might they use it otherwise? How have and learn from other people. I think that's one advantage that new companies have now that maybe earlier rounds didn't, of kind of the first social media companies, or even before that, the first kind of .com companies didn't maybe have that privilege. And now companies do, of like, I'm doing payments. How have people misused PayPal and eBay? I can go look and see what's out there. I'm doing visual, collections. How have people misused Pinterest and Instagram? I can go see what's out there and kind of try and get ahead of the curve that way too.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think some teams or companies can get overwhelmed with like all of the things that could happen. And for me, it's really helpful to like sort of hone in and think about like, what are our biggest risks? Like, what does our product do? And like you were saying, Caitlin, like how do people think it could be misused? And like that can start to get you a list of things that you're most worried about or like most want to guard against. I think having like the basics in place for your team goes a really long way. So like tools for them to take actions, like clear policies. I think Lindsay, you touched on something really important earlier, which is like retention is important. So like support those people and like make sure they have good schedules and support and pay and all that sort of stuff. Like they're going to do a lot for your company. The other thing I'd say is that you know that something is going to go wrong, but you don't exactly know what. So having the right tools and processes in place can help you adapt and like think on your feet. So like have some good escalation processes in place, like have some good channels for like if somebody like in user support or anywhere, or somebody gets an email or a LinkedIn message, they know where to go to and they can trust that something's gonna happen and somebody's gonna do something about it. So without being able to hone in and say like, here's a list of things you got to worry about, and here's how you do it. I'm more about like building the foundations, because like as with other dimensions in a startup, you have to be able to adapt and pivot, and that is especially true in trust and safety.
I kind of want to thank you. That's super helpful. If I were a startup founder, I definitely would be listening very closely to what the three of you have to say because you've seen it all. And the thing that I'm picking up is this notion that trust and safety doesn't have to be a department, right? Like if you're a startup, it doesn't have to be like a 10-person team out the gate. But what is important is to mainstream this idea that like it is necessary to keep a healthy community on your service, right, in order for you to grow as a service or as a product. And that sort of in some ways, all of these different teams are accountable for that, right, in some way. And that it is a multidisciplinary sort of practice, which I find, at least in my experience, and it sounds like from yours as well, like it has been a very multidisciplinary practice, right? Caitlin, you started from public policy. Lindsay, you started doing law enforcement stuff as well. Like, you started kind of doing this like moving into analytics from what you did. It's a highly multidisciplinary sort of field. So which kind of brings me to my next question, which is a little bit of, still putting on my faux startup founder hat. What would you tell me I need to hire for, right? Because I want to be able to give, people who haven't had like 10 years of trust and safety experience, right? Like I want to give people opportunity. Maybe they're new to the field, but they have a background in particular areas, or they have particular skill sets. And maybe this is going to vary from product to product, service to service, but are there high level sort of skill sets that you would advise me as a startup founder to start looking at if I were to hire my first trust and safety hire?
I think a lot of them are what you're hopefully thinking about generally as a startup founder, given that you're probably small, need to be really agile, as Sev was saying, everyone wears different hats, as Lindsay was saying, but I think some of the most important skills we've seen, someone with a bias towards action. So many of the problems that we are all faced with every day have no super good or clear or easy answers. And if you get caught up in that or in looking for the perfect, you're just not going to do anything. And that's almost always the worst outcome. So someone who both has a bias towards action and knows how to get things done. I think we found that there are lots of people who can talk about these super interesting ideas, but then when it comes to the execution phase, what does it mean to kind of make this happen? As Sev was talking about, who am I actually going to call and wake up at 1 in the morning? Will they have a button to press? Will they know what to do? Like, will we be able to count it? I think those things matter a lot, especially at a startup.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I always say is kind of critical thinking, or being able to think about these really complex issues, both being able to take something really big like child safety and figuring out how to break it down into what do I need to care about first, and also being able to work in the opposite direction. So you get this one case or one ticket coming in and being able to think about, okay, well, if I do this, what precedents does it set? What adversarial actions might happen? What might happen next? But I almost think it's all trial and error. So I would optimize more towards someone who knows how to get stuff done more than anything else. If I'm putting my hat on to advise my fictional Adeline startup founder.
Taking notes.
We're gonna jointly found one after this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's my real plan in
talk our way
moderating
into that. Like, yeah, we'll just end early and and
This
go
is going to
inside.
turn into a VC pitch halfway through.
Yeah, exactly. How many founders do we have in the call? Okay, so I would say like I +1 to all of that, like Caitlin said, and I think the things that are my go-tos for hiring in trust and safety, like I might characterize them a little bit different, but I think they overlap a lot with what Caitlin, you were saying. Definitely want people who are like proactive. I think Caitlin, you were talking about like the bias for action. Like if you see something, like say something, do something about it, especially if you think it's going to be risky. And similar to like what you were saying, Caitlin, like this applies to like startups broadly for all things, but you want people who are builders. So like they're going to be building workflows from scratch. They're going to be standing up stuff. They're going to be writing playbooks so that they can run it again. And you just have to have people who are willing to like get their hands dirty and build. And then one thing I always like to look for is curiosity. So like people who explore questions, they are like learning about stuff like on their own. They kind of like dig into like individual like tickets or requests or situations that look fishy to see like how much of it, like how much more of it might be out there. And like you were saying, Adeline, like this doesn't point to a particular profession. Like there's people from all different types of backgrounds. When I sit down with a recruiter, like I'm not saying like I want 5 or 10 years of like trust and safety experience, one, because like we're a pretty young industry, but also like you get this from people who have like NGO backgrounds or consulting or law enforcement, whatever it is. And I think that's actually one of the things that makes this work great is you work with all different types of people and like you're really incentivized to bring in people from all different types of backgrounds. And you see super diverse teams, which is really important to me. And again, like going back to like, why am I still in this work? Like, because I love the people and like, that's how it's set up like naturally, I think.
And make friends with your sourcers and recruiters because they kind of hate you when you give that answer of like, well, it really could be anyone. I just want someone really smart. I don't have a resume in mind. You can't search for that on LinkedIn. So they don't like it.
Oh my God. Yep. Yep. I'm very lucky to have worked with the same recruiter at Discord who also hired me. So we've got a long partnership. Yeah, I would say hire someone who geeks out about trust and safety because whether they're going to be the person hiring and building out your trust and safety team and you want their passion to be infectious for that group of people, or they're going to be a team of 1 or maybe 2 for however long, and they're going to need to be working really closely with other folks in your company and infecting them with their passion for trust and safety. I think this kind of connects to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier about how trust and safety is such an emerging, developing field. Even if the people at your company right now know what trust and safety is and know why you hired that trust and safety person, you're hiring in other teams. And the new people who join your company are going to have totally different understandings of what trust and safety is, and they might not have any idea about what it is. And so you need someone who's like so excited about trust and safety that those new people are going to know what trust and safety is. And I think part of the reason why I say like I would index higher for, GASP, like some of the soft skills like passion, communication, empathy, is because somebody who's like super passionate and curious, to Sev's point, like that person is going to pick up hard skills pretty easily, especially if they've got the support of like the other people with hard skills in your company who are thrilled to be working with this trust and safety person and want to help them learn those hard skills. Like hard skills come along easily, I guess is kind of an unpopular thing to say, but you can't really teach someone to have EQ. And this is an area where empathy for your users is just extremely important. So.
Yeah, one of my, I love that you said that about the soft skills versus hard skills. One of my closest friends likes to say, the thing about soft skills is that they're actually really hard. And I've always found that to be a very illuminating kind of insight because it's true, right? And I just kind of want to I guess, affirm the fact that with trust and safety, in my experience as well, just like, you know, the three of you have pointed out, like having kind of this innate desire to be proactive about doing the right thing or doing the good thing for your community, it's really, really important. And it's hard to even get started in trust and safety if you kind of don't really, if that's not your thing, right? Maybe something else would be your thing. Okay, I'm gonna stick with the insufferable shtick about me being a startup founder. I'm gonna be like, okay, like I hear what all of you are saying. I've got, you know, a super passionate person on board. They're really like, you know, they're biased to action. Like, yes, I found that they actually have the ability to project manage. I've seen them work in a different industry cross-functionally. Really, really loving this person that I've hired. Right. But here's the thing, right? I don't know how long they're going to stay in this job, because it seems like there are a lot of challenges to this work. And it seems like they're telling me that they're not really understanding how their work is paying off. Right. So my question to you, my trust and safety advisors, is can you tell me a little bit about kind of some of the key challenges that this person is facing, because I have no clue. And then the second thing is, and maybe we can break this down into two sections. So the first thing is challenges. And then the second thing is sort of like, how do people, you know, who work in trust and safety build their resilience by seeing some kind of payoff, right? Because sometimes it's hard, right? You don't really see the outcome of your work. So are there things that you do with your teams to demonstrate like, hey, like this is a really positive outcome? And it could be, you know, maybe it's metrics, maybe it's something else. But can you first tell me a little bit about challenges that, you know, this hire would face? And I know there are a lot, so keep it short.
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult work. And I think like especially in the last year and a half with COVID, when folks who don't work with the most toxic radioactive content have also been reporting burnout. This is like an especially important time to be thinking about this. And it's not easy. I think that that like kind of magical 4-square grid of like urgent versus important, turns out that when you're talking about safety issues where the outcome could be like harm to a real life human, it's a lot harder to decide that something isn't urgent or important. Mm-hmm. And so aside from working with wellness counselors, which I think is increasingly becoming the industry standard, and I think it's amazing, I think that having operational processes that account for the urgent nature of needing to potentially intervene to save someone's life, actually, not to be overly dramatic, but to scale those operations really thoughtfully. Do the headcount projections, figure out if you're going to be outsourcing and what tools your outsourcers are going to need. And, you know, if you're going to be waking people up at 3 a.m. to work on things, like how often is that going to happen? Mm-hmm. What are you going to do when it starts happening 4 or 5 times a night and your team is pretty small? Not to scare you, startup founder, you keep at it, but scaling those operations is going to go such a long way towards making people feel supported and held as employees, and celebrate wins wherever you have them, no matter how small, because that is like a pretty wonderful antidote to the chaos and uncertainty and dealing with the worst parts of humanity. So
I suppose I can briefly put on, you know, I mentioned I was in analytics before hopping over to Pinterest here. And like, I think it's worth mentioning that like, as you start to build out your team and you're talking about things like service level agreements, SLAs, and turnaround times and stuff like that, to really embrace those and humanize them. So it's not just a number on a chart. I like to think about it in almost just like a simple sentence and say like, hey, you know, a lot of people reached out today and they got an answer within 24 hours. We took down a bunch of bad things that like other people, now they don't have to see it on our platform. And that's that's worth something.
Yeah.
I think in addition to what Lindsay, you were saying, of course, like Pinterest, like a lot of other companies, like we really try to put our foot forward on supporting reviewers and getting them counseling resources. Like, we go the full gamut on those sorts of things. I think in tandem with that, and this is like my personal opinion, there's a lot of perspective to have in trust and safety work on what you are truly accountable for and what you're not accountable for. So where it all, converges for me is like in one sentence, like, I think if you're doing your job and you did the best that you could, and you're working to do that job better, you should feel that you did your part. So in trust and safety, I think we have to be humble about how much we truly influence the outcome and not fully rely. Of course, we want to like find those celebration moments and like success stories and stuff like that, but we can't fully rely because we don't always hear back about every outcome. And while we're fighting, the good fight, it takes an entire ecosystem to like do this work. And there's a number of circumstances that led to that situation that, like that happened. And there's a bunch of things that will happen after you escalate or send it out to the right authorities that you may or may not have influence over. So that all being said, that's the perspective that I have. It takes a while to like make peace with that and practice it every day. But for me, it's an essential perspective to have like when you're working in a tough space like this, because I think there's a lot that needs to go into to support people and keep them going in this work.
I cannot plus one what Sev just said enough. I think it is, in my experience, what makes this work the hardest, especially for new folks, is just feeling overwhelmed and like you're not making any progress. Because if you put the finish line at save every child in the world from harm, or change hearts and minds on anti-Semitism, or make sure no one ever takes their own life, you are going to feel overwhelmed. You're not going to do that. But as Sev said, it's because that is actually not your job. And that's not what success means. And that's not what's in your control. Before I came to trust and safety, I worked in rape crisis and domestic violence work. And a lot of that mindset has been so helpful in this work. But we were often faced with kind of the same issue where actually maybe even a crisis moment of a sexual assault was not the worst thing going on in that person's life, and they needed so much other help, and there were so many other circumstances. And I still remember a manager sitting me down and saying, we do one thing, we help people with one slice of something, and we need to focus on that and do that well. There are other people who do the other things. We can do referrals, we can help connect them to resources. We are one piece of a larger ecosystem. And if you forget that and try to solve everything for everyone, you're not doing your one piece well. And we actually really need you to do your one piece well. And I think that's really hard, especially frankly right now in the tech world, where a lot of media, a lot of reporting, a lot of criticism from regulators, which is, we should all be held to account. Trust and safety is hugely important, and we need to do it right. And we need external people giving us input and holding us to account. But sometimes that commentary can make it seem like, oh, none of these problems existed before these platforms. They don't exist outside of them. And so the platforms have full responsibility to solve them all. And as Sev said, I think really deciding what success is you helped someone that day, you removed something from your platform, you did what was in your control, instead of getting overwhelmed and defining success as, fixing misogyny, which, is going to be a lot harder. And you're maybe one piece of 1,000 different pieces out there in the world working on that issue.
Yeah. Turns out, as a startup founder, even though I think my service and my product is going to be so transformative, but it turns out that misogyny existed in the world before my product and service came, online. So, what I'm picking up, it's actually really interesting. What I'm picking up is sort of this idea that, there is a constellation of things, right, that we all contribute to, like on a societal level, that allows people to feel kind of like safer online. And there are different kind of partnerships or different kind of organizations that each do a different component of the work. And that's really important because it's a societal, there is a societal aspect to this. But then also that's mirrored almost internally at these companies where your trust and safety team can't really be successful on its own unless you have like this broader constellation kind of thinking within the company that allows for this cross-functional kind of collaboration and cooperation around, hey, like our ultimate goal is to grow as a company. That's our job, you know, and let's not be too naive about it, right? Like that's job security, right? And that's how I'm going to make oodles of money as a startup founder. But it's also, you know, one of the components to long-term growth is making sure that people feel really safe on the platform, and it is also absolutely the right kind of thing to do. So I know we have about 9 minutes left. I just kind of want to quickly summarize, you know, our conversation about building a trust and safety team, and then I will leave maybe a little bit of time for the 3 of you to maybe share some parting words. So you can think about that as I kind of summarize this building a team panel. The things that are sort of pulled out are, you know, you know, when you're starting a team and you're thinking about trust and safety, it's not just about hiring one person to be solely accountable for trust and safety. This is a systems issue. It's sort of a values and principles issue. It's a team ethos issue, right? So it can't just live, you know, it's great to have one person think through what your trust and safety program is going to look like, but that person's not going to be successful unless everyone is on board with the idea that it is the right thing to do to keep the platform safe and build these defensible kind of measures to protect users on the service or on the platform. So that's like the big like takeaway in terms of like, if I were a startup founder and I was trying to start this trust and safety culture in my company, what do I need to think about? The other thing that we touched on was hiring and the kinds of people that we want to bring into the field. And what I heard from the 3 of you is that like, look, like there's no reason to gatekeep to people who have already done trust and safety work, right? Like let's, you know, this is one of the Trust and Safety Professional Association things, which is, you know, let's build a community and let's democratize access, right, to resources. Let's democratize access to experts who have done the work before so that we can bring more people into our community. And that's really important to us as an organization. So I heard that echoed from you all. It was really gratifying to hear that, because I think increasingly I'm hearing people saying like, hey, I'm actually really interested in fighting online abuse. How do I get started? So the things that we should look out for are more like qualities around being able to project manage or being able to execute really well from start to finish, and having the heart and soul, right? Like these intangible things, the heart and soul to really commit to a mission to keep users safe from harm online. So that's what I heard from the hiring front. And then from the third front, like I guess this is where it gets a little bit trickier, because we're talking about how do you prove to people that their work is truly making a difference. And what I heard from you was like, it's not just numbers, right? Like these are real people, but at the same time, having the perspective that you're not, as a trust and safety professional, you're not being tasked to save the world, right? Even though it feels like that on so many days, what you're being tasked with is to be as successful as you can in the one component of your part of the ecosystem. And hopefully, right, with the long-term thinking, doing that work really well has a long-term impact, and it's not going to be something that you see overnight. And it sounds a little bit like, keep at it, you know, keep at it, little soldier. But I actually truly believe that it is a long-term kind of long-term work, right? And that it never goes away, just because there are so many things that go on in the world that, you know, expose people to harm. In the last 5 minutes that we have left, would love to hear kind of like final things that you want this you know, this audience to hear about building a trust and safety team. And anyone can go.
Yes,
I guess,
can. I'll go ahead. No, I went first last time.
I was just going to say, I guess that it is tremendously impactful and rewarding work. Just to end on that note, because I feel like in talking about how hard it is and that you can't save everyone and that it is so narrow, to also not forget though the impact that you can have is huge. The stories that we hear of someone took down a video where I was being shown, you know, in a non-consensual kind of revenge porn way, you took that down. That is life-changing. I lost access to this account that had all of my memories of my deceased parents or my childhood or my access to my friends all around the world. I have it back now. That is hugely impactful. Like every single thing you get to do every day is also just kind of like really awe-inspiring when you take a step back. And I think that can be easy to miss, and it can be easy to talk about some of the secondary trauma and the burnout and the difficulties, which are real and important. But in the vein of celebrating wins, I think I would just end with saying it's a tremendously rewarding and impactful career, both in terms of the individuals you can help and the overall systems you can shape.
Yeah, I'd plus one all of that Caitlin just said. It's super important work. Never forget what it means to people when you're working a queue or improving a process. Like even if you're like automating stuff like that goes a long way because it frees you up to do like more interesting stuff. I think for founders, people in the work, managers, like support your people. Make sure, like I mentioned before, like they have good schedules, they have good pay. Really work on figuring out what the right benefits are that, you know, fulfill all the values that think will you think will build a great atmosphere for them and keep them like supported in the work. And going off of like what Caitlin was saying, like this is a great and it's a growing profession. So explore it, find what you love, put yourself out there for roles and things like that, raise your hand. I think it is an excellent time to get involved and to grow in it. And hopefully being able to see like from us on the panel, like there's a path and it's a great one and it's great folks in it. So hopefully that's something you can take away from this conversation.
All right. So I guess the two things that I will say is one, I guess directed to this startup founder growing company. If you're betting on your company growing, then you're also betting on abuse problems growing. And I've had people ask me, like, what's the most challenging abuse vertical? And there are challenges for all abuse verticals. And depending on your product and your personal values, you might be able to pick one. But I actually think that the biggest problem for trust and safety in the industry right now is scale. And so be thinking about what scale will look like for your trust and safety team early on if you're seeing adoption numbers go up for your product. And then two, for the people doing this work, in addition to all of the like resilience, amazing stuff that like Caitlin and Seb were talking about, stay listening and like watching what other companies are doing. We're not like we're a part of companies, but we're not in competition with each other. And I think that we can share our learnings about what worked and what didn't work with each other. And we don't have to like laugh at like, oh, that company really messed that up in trust and safety and it was really public and embarrassing. It's like, no, like they probably did a lot of stuff right for us to learn from too. And they might have learnings from being up close with whatever that very public thing was that you could benefit from. And so like keep a level of humility and like listen and pay attention because this is really a growing area where we all have a lot to learn.
I really appreciate that last point. And what I found is that this trust and safety community has always been very open to sharing without kind of revealing proprietary information. I always have that footnote, sharing kind of best practices, right, for how best to keep people safe online. So with that, I want to thank the three of you for your time. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your wisdom with this group. And also thank you so much for doing the work that you do and continuing to do it and paying it forward for other people in the community. I really, really appreciate it. With that, I am actually going to close out this panel, and I want to let everyone know that the second panel is called Planning for the Next Global Crisis, Trust and Safety Lessons Learned from COVID-19, which is very timely, and also will have a lot of nuggets of good information for startup founders and non-startup founders. Please stay tuned, because I think we're going to a screen, and then it's going to take a short bit for that panel to be queued up, and then we'll be ready to go. So stay tuned, hang on the line, and again, thank you to our panelists for sharing all these wise words. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this second session of today's event on the future of online trust and safety. I'm David Sullivan from the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, and I'm delighted to be moderating this second session, Planning for the Next Global Crisis, Trust and Safety Lessons Learned from COVID-19. So for those who were here for the first panel, I think we had an incredible sort of inside look at what it means to be staffing and building a trust and safety team inside a company. Some invaluable advice, whether it's for founders of startups that are going to be the giant platforms of tomorrow, or folks looking for a career in the trust and safety field. In this panel, we're going to sort of take a look from the outside in and speak with experts who are really at the forefront of some of what the first panel called trust and safety verticals, but some of the key issues that companies are working to respond to, whether that is child protection, counterterrorism, disinformation, and other issues as well. So let me just quickly introduce our panel. We have Stephen Balcom from the Family Online Safety Institute, Aaron Saltman from the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, Danny Rogers, from the Global Disinformation Index, Rob Ruckowitz from the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, and Spandy Singh from the Open Technology Institute. Welcome to all of you. And we have a big panel, a lot of issues to get through in a short amount of time. So I'm going to try to moderate in a brisk fashion. So starting off, seeing as it is kind of back to school season right now, whether school is happening in person, online, or in some hybrid fashion, I want to start with Stephen from the Family Online Safety Institute. Stephen, no one knows better than families with school-age children just how disruptive this pandemic has been and how that struggle continues. So my question for you is, amid this shift in the online environment that we've been experiencing, whether for children and parents alike, how is your work trying to foster a safe environment online for children and families? How has it changed? What are you seeing?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for involving us in this conversation. Really, really appreciate it. You know, if you cast your mind back to 2019, which already feels like a very long time ago, the big issue at that time, and we were all tearing our hair out, was the amount of screen time that our kids were having. And there were conferences and books and editorials. And then COVID came along, and guess what? Screen time went up dramatically. Not just for our kids, but for us as well, either working from home, remotely, or whatever. And actually, we started to look at the distinction between screen time and screen use. And obviously, if your kids are using their screens for school, for socialization, for talking to grandma, that is a very good use of their screen, even though it means that the time that they're on it has dramatically increased because of COVID. So that's probably the most dramatic shift that we've seen. The other thing that I think is a silver lining with COVID is the amount of cross-generational conversations about technology. And it's not all just one way, because so often the kids are offering tech support to their parents who are desperately trying to get on a Zoom call or, make this new app that their work has asked them to use. And, we also did some research last year on parental controls and the attitudes that parents have towards them. This year, we're looking at online safety tools and the way in which teens and young people, their attitudes and their use. And I think there's a dramatic shift towards the use of online safety tools that the kids use themselves to block, to report, to stay private. And for that matter, to shift stuff onto your members. You will probably see a dramatic increase and continue to see an increase as more and more young people use those tools. So there's 2 or 3 examples right there.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that point about how even young users can sort of take control using the kind of tools that are being rolled out to help have their own safe experience is an important one. So I want to pivot rather dramatically from that point about users sort of seeking a safe environment to be able to sort of, live their lives online, where we live so much of our life right now, to the other side of things, and to folks who are perhaps actively looking to harm other users online, and turn to Erin from the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. So Erin, obviously we've seen whether, at the US Capitol on January 6th or in Kabul, violent extremists, have not rested on their laurels during this pandemic. So, in your work, both working with technology companies, but also government agencies and others, kind of what sort of shifts have you observed when it comes to that field?
Yeah, well, I guess in some ways, violent extremists and terrorists have always looked to online spaces to find safe places to be online as well, not safe for others, but safe for their networks. And so that cat and mouse game and the adversarial shifts can sometimes happen very quickly. And obviously, to our original point, more screen time does mean more opportunity to try to find and exploit those spaces online. I would say, our whole point, the reason we're a little bit different is that we were originally founded by tech companies for tech companies. GiftCT started as an initiative founded by Facebook, Microsoft, YouTube, and Twitter. And then that came out of that original ISIS nexus point where people realized, okay, if good actors none of us have just one app on our phone. None of us are just on one platform. And then we're very surprised when bad actors use a multitude of apps. And we think it means they're so tech savvy, when in essence, it just means that they're modern and they're operating just like all of us. We have more private conversations when we want to talk to our friends, maybe on an end-to-end encrypted platform, and we want to exploit the good things we do on more public platforms. And actually, these bad actors are very similar. And that goes to a lot of different ways they use their tactics. So when we're trying to think through things, especially in the pandemic, it became increasingly the case that nothing was just on one platform. Everything is very not just cross-platform, but transnational. So especially with some of these more marginalized extremist viewpoints, we all go online to find our community, and they are doing the same. The difference with COVID, I think, is we definitely saw more of that increased nexus point with misinformation and conspiracy theories. So some of these extremist groups, while hyped up and stuck at home, found community that were edging that extremist purview more towards violence. A lot of the misinformation actually came into play with things like Save the Children conspiracy theories, and in some of the US and Western European contexts, those conspiracy theories really drove people to violence. That predates the pandemic a little bit, but we could see that it was hypercharged while people were at home. And for us, there's also that point of violent extremism ultimately is offline. So you can say horrible things online. A lot of that doesn't end up in the offline space, but we do see the nexus point of when something goes online to offline. And that's where it can't just be tech companies working together. There's a lot of communication with government stakeholders and law enforcement, as well as the human rights community, to make sure you're not countering terrorism at the cost of privacy or at the cost of these other fundamental human rights. And these are always trade-offs that we're having to kind of go through. And so I think our question is constantly, where can we appropriately share technology across platforms in a way that does not violate privacy, GDPR, or other human rights? That's always a subtext. Where can we just get better knowledge sharing? So a lot of smaller platforms do not have in-house counterterrorism subject matter experts. And if they do, it's probably not about the 3%ers, Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo movement, some of these newer white supremacy based or far right extremist, if we want to use that term, based groups. So just having a lot of broad knowledge sharing between the academic community in quick form ways is really important. That's part of the reason we fund the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. It's just to get global academics around the world to write very quick blog form adversarial shift pieces for tech companies to digest. But then there's also the question of, how do we do crisis response? So we do have a content incident framework where we share with our member platforms just incidents that are going on around the world. And then that escalates if we think there's an online aspect to that. So we've seen things like the Christchurch attack in New Zealand was obviously a really big reflection point when you see a live streamed attack. That is the online, offline point of meeting in the most horrible way, and it goes viral very quickly. So we learn from other harm types. This does not start just with terrorism. We've learned from the child safety space with what NCMEC's doing on child exploitation. GIFCT does the same thing on having a taxonomy around terrorist groups and being able to share hashed content between platforms around terrorist propaganda. And so I think it's important that we keep in mind, you know, COVID accelerated some things, but we weren't starting from zero. Thankfully, a lot of good work has been done by tech platforms. I'm glad that the last 3 panelists from 3 different tech platforms are all GIFCT members, and we're not starting from zero. It's not the wild, wild west, but maybe we're starting at 6 out of 10. And we now are kind of having to see, how do you get from that 6 to that 10?
Thanks, Erin. I think that, you know, referencing the Christchurch attack is, you know, sort of a very, one of the most salient examples of something that, you know, is clearly something that everyone wants to prevent appearing in streams and online. But I think one of the challenges as I turn to Danny is that, of course, there is this much broader set of information, of content and conduct out there happening online that platforms are concerned with, that you know, that especially, you know, information that it may be intended to mislead in one way or another, but how that transforms from ideas into offline action, or and what the sort of where you want to draw that line becomes incredibly challenging. So I'm curious, Danny, given all the research that you've been doing on sort of disinformation risks on digital properties, and, you know, thinking about this in the context of the infodemic side of this pandemic, what would you say, and sort of how can we help platforms approach these challenges and do better?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, just echo other panelists. I appreciate being included in this conversation because I think they're very joined at the hip. And Erin made a few points that I think are perfect segues to the broader conversation around disinformation, because you know, we often kind of find ourselves, when we talk about extremism, we also talk about disinformation, right? And we all have an intuition as to why, but I think the first answer to your question, David, is, how do we define disinformation in the first place in a way that captures that intuition, right? How do we explicitly say what is disinformation? Because it certainly must go beyond lying on the internet, right? I mean, intentionally misleading. I mean, we all intentionally mislead our kids about Santa Claus every Christmas, right? But that doesn't make that disinformation, right? And so what is a more useful definition? I mean, at the Disinformation Index, we view disinformation through this lens of what we call adversarial narrative conflict. So anytime someone is, you know, peddling some narrative, and often that narrative is implicit, not even explicit, and even more often it's created through sort of cherry-picked elements of the truth, not necessarily just wholesale fabrications. Right? It doesn't have to be Santa Claus. I mean, or let's pick an actual like malicious fabrication, right? Like Pope endorses Trump, or, you know, Hillary Clinton from Mars kind of thing, right? But more pernicious things like, you know, the Breitbart immigrant crime section of their website, right? Piecing together, you know, cherry-picked elements of that would technically kind of fact check to be correct, but turning it into some kind of larger adversarial narrative. And in our case, the way we define it is if it's adversarial against an at-risk group or institution, right? And so that could be anti-immigrant narratives, but it could also be, anti-vax narratives that go against science or medicine, or narratives that call into, I mean, even UFO conspiracy theories, right? It's not the UFO part that's the problem; it's the conspiracy theory against the democratically elected governments. You can't trust your government, right? And I know people who've bought into that sort of narrative to the degree that they won't give the government their social security number, right? Like that's how paranoid they are. And so anywhere you have that kind of narrative that is adversarial against that at-risk group or institution, and most importantly, that carries with it some risk of harm. And this gets to kind of another point that Aaron made is what is that risk of harm, right? In the case of terrorism, there's a very clear singular event, right? 9/11 or the El Paso shooting or something like that, the Christchurch event, right? There's a very clear risk of harm, but I think in the pandemic, we've seen the much broader, kind of less easily encapsulated risk of harm, things like health outcomes, right? There's now a very kind of robust and well, I don't know how well publicized study it is, but an economic study that demonstrated that they went county by county in the United States and said which show on Fox News someone watched directly or was the majority watched in that county directly correlated in a robust and significant way with the health outcomes for COVID-19 in that county. So showing that if you watched the show on Fox News that was more skeptical of the pandemic early on, there was a significantly worse health outcome in that county in the United States than if it was the other way around. So it wasn't even network by network. It wasn't Fox versus CNN. It was within a single network. Just that information diet within that single network had a very strong correlation with higher increase of illness and higher death rates in the pandemic, right? So illustrating a broader risk of harm there, but that study did a great job of illustrating that exact risk of harm that comes from this broader disinformation. It doesn't have to be ISIS recruiting content leading to somebody committing a terrorist attack. It could be somebody calling into question the efficacy of vaccines, and suddenly there's a measles outbreak, right? So really kind of honing in on that definition and on that expected risk of harm, I think is the key to tackling this, right? Recognizing adversarial narratives in all of their different forms, everything from UFOs to the most extreme bigotry, et cetera, and also understanding and building policy around identifying what is that expected risk of harm. And as coming out of our work in the Christchurch call, we've started to publish on our website some examples of frameworks for actually quantifying those risks and prioritizing those risks, right? Whether there's a specific call to action for violence, whether there's a specific, or something more general, kind of building skepticism around some health guidance or something like that. So that to me is the key to how to think about this problem is having a really kind of solid definition that captures that broad umbrella and then focusing on the harms and on harm prevention.
Thanks, Danny. So I think we've already heard in some ways how issue areas that one might think are very distinct from one another, between child protection, countering terrorism and violent extremism and disinformation, are learning from each other and interconnect with each other. And I think that is an important segue as we sort of move into our other panelists who I think are looking at these issues slightly more holistically. And as we look a little bit more towards what sort of concrete steps companies are taking and can be taking in this field. So I'm going to turn to Rob. So while, of course, the size and influence of big technology platforms is dominating conversations and headlines, in every country around the world right now, I think sometimes those conversations often do lose track of the business that some companies are in, many of which are in the advertising game, and that advertisers are a key stakeholder in these conversations. Rob, how are the advertisers that you're working with thinking about how to address this panoply of risks that Stephen, Aaron, and Danny have outlined?
Yeah, absolutely. So, David, thank you for having me. And it's great to be on this panel. So, Absolutely, we tend to look at things more holistically as it relates to the types of harms that are out there. We've identified 11. We'll soon to be able to add a 12th one on there as well. And fundamentally, it's gone from a position within the industry where it was very much, I would say, turn-based, where it would be that there was a security breach or brand safety incident where ads were misplaced or content that that shouldn't have been monetized was monetized, e.g. ads placed in it. And it became sort of like, well, whose fault was it anyway? And I think that the conversation has since moved on. It's since moved on from sort of, the initial stages of this, which goes back to like 2010 or so, to 2017, big brands fund terror, to the Christchurch massacre, and then also the pedophilia network being uncovered in the space of 3 weeks. And there was just a tipping point. We already had work underway to address this, where we wanted to get a multi-stakeholder conversation in place, where we would be able to get the entire industry together to agree on that there were certain that basically monetization is privilege. It's not a right. That not all content is created equally. And I think that's something that Stephen touched upon. Well, not all screen time is created equally. And really what we wanted to do was make sure that there is a consistent approach, because in our research, we found that the top pain point for marketers and agencies was working across multiple platforms with different standards. For the platforms, it was having worked with multiple clients and advertisers who had different standards. So really what we wanted to do was take some of the learnings from, say, like the Dewey Decimal System, and how do we start applying this to different content types, and how can we agree to a standardized way of looking at content types that are problematic. We've done this in a way that's been collaborative, that's gone from confrontation to collaboration, and agreeing to certain standards. And those standards are being created in a collaborative fashion, and then taken into each company to adopt them and implement them. And we've seen adequate implementation within the marketer agency community, and then also the platforms, and also more importantly within ad tech, and seeing this consistent approach, which is fundamentally allowing advertisers as well as the platforms to move revenue and basically advertising support into content that is more reflective of good connections online. I think that the platforms struggle with this, in terms of moderating, because nobody wants to be accused of squelching free speech. But by the same token, the freedom to advertise and monetize needs to be put against content that is right and that is on the right side of the conversation, and stuff that is not going to create harm, either for the advertiser, the consumer / user, the platform itself. Because fundamentally the way that we look at this is, if there is harmful content that is out there that is open access and is not sort of contained, and advertising supports it, it's going to bring the industry down. And I don't think that that's anything that anybody wants to do. I think that we're going through some interesting sort of, I would say, inflection points to determine how do we manage the tensions between sort of freedom of speech and advertising reach, quality of connection, and quality of media impressions, the way that a campaign reaches individual consumers. And I think that we're starting to make good headway, and it's around definitions, it's around measurement, it's around managing adjacency, and it's also making sure that there's independent oversight, which are the four big rocks that we are continuing to push forward.
Thanks, Rob. That's really fascinating. Looking forward to digging more into some of those rocks, so to speak, later on in the discussion. I want to turn to Spandy last, but certainly not least. We've talked about a range of different issues so far, and you can sort of look at these issues from the kind of manifestly illegal types of content, like child sexual abuse material, to down the spectrum to the kind of lawful but awful content that, of course, advertisers might not want to support, but where we get into these questions around risks to freedom of expression and other fundamental rights from constraining certain types of content. This tension, sort of in your work at the Open Technology Institute, how would you advise companies on how to address these things? And is there anything that you've observed sort of during this kind of pandemic era that you would want to highlight?
Definitely, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation. So I think even before the pandemic, platforms have continuously been trying to strike a balance between removing harmful content and preserving free expression and human rights online. And that tension is very much present today, but I think we've seen a number of important shifts in how platforms have been approaching these issues. And I think these shifts bring with them some really important lessons. So I'm just going to briefly touch on 3 of them. The first one started before the pandemic, but I think it was really amplified during the pandemic. And that's over the last 4 or 5 years, we as a society have learned and seen more evidence of the harms that can result from certain types of content spreading online. And so, when I first joined the space, many of the content moderation conversations we were having as civil society and policy folks really centered on this underlying notion that if it's not illegal, we want to preserve it. We want to, the free expression concerns are based on that. But I think this perspective, free expression is of course very important, but that perspective was kind of grounded in this privilege as a society that the majority of people did not understand the harms that could result from content online. So before 2016, political disinformation and hate speech were not a common part of our daily conversations. Similarly, like Danny pointed out, health misinformation was an issue before COVID, but never really at this scale. And so as these harms have become more apparent, there's been this shift in how we place responsibility on platforms, and preserving speech online is of course critical, but I think we've seen that this tension between preserving speech online and removing harmful content is now deeply intertwined with this idea that platforms need to keep our users and society safe. And this is something that trust and safety teams have been working on for years, but this part of the discourse has not really been part of the policy conversations and the civil society conversations until more recently. But now, as you sort of mentioned, platforms are removing a lot of content. We have extremism online, we have disinformation online. Platforms have this pressure to remove content, but I think this can also result in harmful outcomes. And so over the last few years, there's been a lot of really great research from civil society, from academics, on how platforms have begun relying on AI and ML-based tools to fuel their content moderation operations. These tools are often limited in their ability to effectively judge content, which may have fluid definitions like disinformation, for example, or that requires context or subjective understanding. So if companies are relying on these tools and not including a human in the loop and are flagging and removing content, then we can see overbroad removals. And this raises free expression concerns. We want platforms to take down the violating content, not the innocuous content. And a lot of research has demonstrated that companies' automated tools are less effective when it comes to non-English speech or the speech of non-dominant groups. And so those are the groups that are typically the most impacted and whose speech is the most impacted. During the pandemic, I think this issue around automation has really come to a head because many companies announced at the beginning of the pandemic that they were going to rely on these tools more for content moderation as they tried to figure out how to transition their human moderating workforces to a remote work environment. And they warned that you will see mistakes, you will see content moderation errors. And some companies continue to provide users with an appeals process, which I think is really critical, but some companies didn't. And I think that failure to offer an appeals process was a really big concern because users had no way of pushing back against erroneous content moderation decisions. And I hope that this crisis, which is definitely still ongoing, however, is sort of like a learning moment for companies in the future, that they should be building this capacity up so that user rights aren't immediately stripped away during a crisis. Similarly, over the last year, some companies have begun publishing data in their transparency reports that demonstrate the impact of automation on removals. And I'm hoping that one day when we're done with this pandemic, companies will be able to provide a more comprehensive report of how these tools impacted their moderation, so that we can learn from this. And then last but not least, I think especially in the last 2 years, how we talk about content moderation has changed. It used to be a conversation about, are we taking down content or are we leaving it up? But I think especially with COVID misinformation and election disinformation from last year, we've seen companies use a broader range of interventions, like, are you downranking misinformation? Are you intervening in recommender systems? I think these interventions are interesting, but and they've definitely been expanding their use of them during this pandemic. But I would caution against just introducing new interventions during a crisis period without transparency, because it's hard to hold companies accountable if we don't know what are the policies that guide these interventions and what impact are they having.
Thanks, Spandy. That really tees up just a moment for me to flag the work of my own organization, the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, where we have 11 company members coming together and hopefully growing that around a set of 5 commitments for for integrating trust and safety into how companies develop products, govern their services, enforce the rules for services, aim to improve those policies and processes over time, and be transparent with the public. And we're working towards self-assessments and independent assessments of these processes to address this full panoply of sort of what we call content and conduct related risks, to try to be able to learn from these different issue areas and to be more transparent and accountable to the public. So circling back around, Stephen, you led off noting, sort of some research that your organization is conducting and some innovative findings in terms of how young people are using safety controls themselves, which I think sort of, touches upon the point that Spandy was just making in terms of a move to a more granular kind of nuanced approach to how sort of, to dealing with different types of content and conduct online, and that everything's not just about take it down or leave it up, and that actually giving users agency in these decisions, including young people, is a valuable piece of this. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit and tell us more what you're seeing there, and what might be promising. I've been excited that while this pandemic is ongoing, there's been several points about silver linings that we've been able to extract so far in the conversation, and hope to continue that.
Yeah, so just going back to last year's research, not only did we talk to parents about their attitudes and use of parental controls, not surprisingly, we asked teens and young people as well. And again, not surprisingly, there was an overwhelming negative attitude towards parental controls, but a very positive view of these new and emerging online safety tools that many of the social media sites have created over the last few years, almost under the radar. And so under the radar that most parents aren't even aware of it, and many of them are not aware that their kids are actually using them. In fact, we found that more kids were using privacy settings than their own parents. They were using reporting mechanisms more than their own parents. They knew how to block the creeps, and so on. And for them, these tools were not oppressive, quite the reverse. It gave them a sense of agency. It gave them a sense of power, gave them a sense of control over what perhaps a few years ago was kind of a free-for-all in terms of the kind of content and conduct that was going on. So we're digging deeper into that notion this year. We're going to release the results at our conference in November, but not surprisingly, we're seeing again this kind of sense of, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the kids are all right, but they're more all right than we give them credit for sometimes. And even so much so that they are helping their parents to set the controls or to use the controls themselves.
That's terrific. So another point that I want to sort of pull up that's been made by a few folks along the way, and that Aaron, you put very explicitly earlier, is this kind of that all of our lives are lived kind of cross-platform. That's just being a person in the digital age. But that where there is this both, I think, opportunity as well as a challenge in terms of figuring out how companies can cooperate with one another in ways where you are sharing information that is not causing kind of, privacy harms or other concerns, but that allows both for the sort of sharing of information, but also allows smaller platforms, the hypothetical startup from panel number 1 that's just starting to think about these issues and doesn't have, full-time people dedicated to kind of key issues. What are the opportunities there? Is there anything that you would point to, that can help think about how to foster the right kind of collaboration that is, net positive both for companies, users, and society at large, and avoids some of the kind of hurdles that can come up when you bring companies together, potentially in closed settings, to talk about challenging issues.
Right. Well, I think the first thing you should know in the trust and safety space is always to never let a crisis go to waste. So you always learn more from your failures than your successes. And for newer companies, other bigger companies have made those failures before you. So don't feel like you have to fail on your own. Actually talking with different companies and providing forums that allow for not just intercompany communication. So apart from the downstream side of actually making tooling that can work across platforms, things like photo and video hashing and being able to share a hash in a way that's privatized, or URL sharing in a way that gives cross-platform signal. There's actually just some of the basic tangible knowledge sharing between platforms, as well as in a multi-stakeholder setting that allows newer companies to not have to make mistakes 1 through 5 and skip those over because other people have been there and they have a lot of lessons learned. And one of the things we developed, and this is specific just to terrorism and violent extremism, is we actually have multi-stakeholder working groups that meet once a month, and it involves from all around the world a combination of tech sector, government, as well as CSOs, human rights, and academics to discuss a very particular side of the problem. So there's a working group on transparency. What does it mean to give meaningful transparency? Transparency to a government is very different than transparency to a human rights activist, and what it means and what you can convey. Oftentimes, if you ask an engineer for a data report, those numbers mean very little to a third party unless you have kind of a qualitative framework around it to explain why a number went up or down, why more removals happened in Q1 compared to Q2. But we also have, increasingly in this space across harms, we have a working group just on legal frameworks. What we are starting to see is that government X is really solving for privacy and government Y is solving for free speech. And they've both just put out potential legislation and it's starting to contradict. And you are a global platform and you want to have global policies so that your users can act globally on your platform. But we are starting to get some contradictions of where are people solving for privacy versus free speech versus security. And every has already had to draw their line in the sand of where they see themselves, but tech platforms are each having to draw their own lines and sharing kind of the experiences, or actually having a forum where you can ask government, what does this mean for my other way that I operate? The last thing I will say is that oftentimes when we think of bad things online, we immediately think of social media, and specifically we think about 3 or 4 platforms. And obviously there's this much wider diversity. You can start dividing companies on, are they big or are they small? And what challenge does that pose? Do they have subject matter experts or do they not on a given topic? Because you could be a really big company and you still haven't got a counterterrorism team, which is totally fair if that hasn't come across your radar before. Do you have user generated content or not? Those are very different sets of challenges. And then really the one we're seeing now is, are you willing to come to the table and work together to solve this, or are you not? And there are platforms that come to the table, and sometimes they get slapped around just for being at the table because they're the ones being transparent and exploiting when there's a problem. And then there's the companies that don't even want to come to the table and don't want to be on the radar at all. And that's starting to be a divide that we see, especially with where bad actors are finding safe harbor. And so that's something we're trying to be all carrot, no stick. But I think when it comes to when governments interject, one part of the conversation is, okay, what do you do with the companies that aren't even willing to come to the table when we have so many companies that are trying their best, even if they're not totally succeeding, but are trying to get better? And then there's this other shift. So I think those are some of the big things at play. But I think to Stephen's point, considering I deal with a completely doom and gloom subject, when I look at youth behavior online, I'm actually more optimistic at them being just digital natives and understanding their own privacy in ways that maybe the generation before them did not, and self-regulating in a way that has a little more safety by design inherently in their fluency.
So I'm pleased to find points of optimism in this conversation when usually there's so much room for doom and gloom here. That said, I do want to raise another development we're starting to see, which I think is challenging. One where we saw this week in Brazil, a government decree, but also we've seen legal proposals, I think, in other places from certain states here in the United States to Poland and Mexico and elsewhere, where governments are mandating that companies not basically enforce their own rules, that they must carry certain content nominally to fight censorship and support freedom of expression, but it seems like for perhaps more dubious purposes. Danny, I'm curious whether that's something that is on your radar screen and sort of what it means when you have certain governments who are sort of coming at I think particular sort of issues as Aaron pointed to, but we also have some actors that are coming at this from another angle that potentially really constrains the ability of companies to operate to take the kinds of steps we want to see them taking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that's not, particularly new. I mean, anywhere where, someone can benefit from manipulating the information environment, they might want to protect that ability to do so and abuse whatever powers they have to do that. We, even at the GDI, have had to be careful about, who we work with and where we work so that our own work doesn't get kind of abused in that sense for censorship or political retribution and things like that. So we take that very much into account. I think it depends on where you are, and this kind of gets to Aaron's point that as much as these platforms want to, and by the way, I should point out, I also completely agree that and we like to think about the platform. I like to say we think the platform is very wide. It's not just social media companies. It's also merchandising platforms and donation platforms, et cetera, all of whom are part of this larger conversation, infrastructure even, right? But it really comes down to as much as these platforms want to be global, they have to understand that there is a local and regional context to everything that they do, and that that to Spandy's point, the privileged kind of perspective that we have in the United States doesn't apply, and even in our, again, taking it back to some of our own experience, just developing kind of journalistic integrity standards around the world is its own challenge. As we were involved in the whole journalism trust initiative, right? The practices in on parts of the African continent are very different than practices in North America and Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world. That to find that common denominator of what is ethical, what is acceptable, even in just that relatively narrow context, is highly dependent on local and regional differences. So I think as much as these platforms want that, like all businesses, they have to acknowledge the reality that policies made in the kind of privileged environment of the United States are not going to be the same policies that can apply in kind of more politically challenging environments, say South America or Eastern Europe or wherever. And so I think, you know, look, I think they have the resources, so I think that they can roll with it. But I'm not going to say it's not challenging, but you know, it comes with the territory. So it's certainly a strong consideration. I would also say there is, I think, especially in the U.S. context, a very strong focus on free speech, and I think for this audience, it is a very serious consideration when you're talking about the kind of nuts and bolts of a trust and safety kind of policy and situation. But what I would say, you know, when we talk about the larger context, I think there's a little bit too much focus on the free speech part of it, and not, as you know, I think Rob pointed this out earlier, the tension between the larger business models and the kind of the harm reduction piece, right? That, you know, for better or for worse, a lot of this content, for however harmful it is also highly engaging. And you know, depending on the specifics of the business model, there's some business models, you know, when you talk about like open web advertising, like it's a relatively compact portion of the web, and it's not, you know, it's a lot of traffic, but it's not an outsized, you know, it's something that is tractable. But if you're talking about, you know, on platform social media, like a lot of this content drives a lot of engagement, and so there's a lot of tension between kind of, you know, the folks on a platform whose job it is to get people engaged and clicking, and the folks on the platform whose job it is to keep people safe, right? And I think that's a tension that we haven't really solved. And when we have this sort of larger platform liability 230 reform conversation, right? I mean, to Aaron's earlier point, you know, maybe just coming to the table is one of the requirements for having that, you know, having that safe harbor of platform liability, like demonstrate, you know, explicitly that you're meeting some basic level of standards. And I mean, David, maybe your organization ends up being the one that sets that standard, right? But you can envision a world which is a lot less kind of black and white extreme as it is now, where, you know, it's all free speech and no liability, right? And there's some productive ground there which brings it into harmony. And you know, maybe the margins on a social media platform aren't quite as, you know, insane as they have been, right? But in order to, you know, keep literally society and democracy safe and preserve, honestly, the Enlightenment, like, these are things that have to be done. So we certainly are aware of that tension and aware of that challenge, and I don't have an easy way around it other than it has to be a consideration.
Maybe actually, if Rob, I'd be interested to hear your response to the point Danny raised regarding the sort of the business incentives and how GAR might be looking at that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, like, look, I think that over-reliance on any singular KPI is never a good thing, and that you actually have to look at things from a balanced scorecard perspective. And I think that's true to probably just about every situation, and say that it's true when, you know, an advertiser or an agency is evaluating where to place a campaign, where to spend a single, you know, dollar on an advertising campaign. And you know, it's not just sort of like the cost of reach, but it's also the quality of reach, which is what I've said before. Quality of reach, you know, safety as well as suitability are taken into account there. And if you go into a place where you're just buying an audience and you have no choice or control over where your ad shows up, then that's a bad thing. And that's fundamentally sort of the way that we have to think about this, which is, how do you restore transparency? How do you restore control, that people actually have a choice, that they can actually say, hey, listen, you know, my beliefs are X, Y, and Z, then therefore my media budget is going to be placed this way on Facebook. It may include or exclude these certain platforms or these certain, you know, ad networks in open web. So sort of the websites that are off of the platforms. And then fundamentally, that's the mission here, is how do we create transparency and control? The way that I would speak about this from an analogy perspective is, imagine going into a grocery store. Imagine having no understanding of what aisle you're walking down and being asked to pick up a tin and then take it home, eat it, no matter what it is, whether it's dog food, whether it's bathroom cleaner, or whether it's expired. Well, that was the current state for advertisers previously, which was you just had zero choice. You had 0 cents. Oh, I want to be able to sort of reach X, Y, Z sort of consumer. who's, not bought the, let's just make it up, the candy category in the last 30 months. Well, guess what? You would have been next to sort of hate speech, or you would have been against sort of hard news that you might not necessarily align with, or sensationalist sort of on the fringe of misinformation. Now, when you give folks back that sort of transparency and control, you understand what aisle you're in, you understand what tin you're picking up, you're able to look over and see that it's expired or not, and see what the sort of nutritional content is on it. And while that just makes for a better transaction, people are more likely to show back up again. And I think fundamentally that's the sort of giant learning that the entire digital industry is walking away with, which is more controls are absolutely a better thing. We've seen this in the movie picture industry association. We've seen this in video games. We've seen this on TV. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel just because it's new. We can learn from other media types and other industries and improve the state of play for advertisers, consumers, the platforms themselves, and industry at large.
Thanks, Rob. So it's interesting. I think, one of the ways that we sort of look at these, at how companies can respond to these issues at the DTSP is across kind of people, which really was the focus of today's first panel, processes and policies, and then also technologies. And I think, we're seeing, whether it's for users, whether it's for advertisers, a greater set of tools that can be used. But I think coming back around to Spandy, who raised the point of increasing reliance on technological approaches that have their own risks, especially since the pandemic, when companies said we're going to rely more on artificial intelligence and machine learning to do some of these things, and the point was raised that this can also have consequences for vulnerable or underrepresented groups and communities. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to that, Spandy, and then we've got about 7 minutes left. So after that, I think we'll do one lightning round question to everybody to wrap things up. But first, over to you, Spandy.
Definitely, thanks. So I think there's a lot, like I mentioned, there's a lot of really great research that's increasingly detailing the kinds of harms that can result from the use of these technologies. Where I think we need to focus on in the future is what can we do about it? So transparency is something that we've all been pushing for a very long time. And I think Aaron made some really great points about is transparency for who? And who is actually using this transparency? How can it be translated into an actionable result that promotes greater accountability, fairness, and so on? I also think in the transparency conversations, especially around AI, we're kind of reckoning with what is meaningful transparency. If I know all of the metrics that you base your recommender system off, is that going to help me as a user exercise greater control or agency? Probably not. Is it going to let a lawmaker exercise greater control, a civil society or researcher? So I think we need to have greater conversations to understand what transparency can actually result in the outcomes that we want. And I think, the more I have these conversations, I also realize that many people want different outcomes. Some people are just no algorithms. Some people are better algorithms. Some people are somewhere in between, right? So I think that, and I can use this to plug a report that we actually released yesterday that talks about how platforms and governments can approach the conversation around promoting accountability around high-risk AI. I think that there needs to be a lot of more multi-stakeholder conversations around this. Governments are, Aaron mentioned this, governments are solving for one thing, society is solving for another thing, users want another thing. And this sort of landscape of promoting accountability around algorithms, I think is really the next frontier in terms of platform accountability. And I think if we want to get it right, which I really hope we do, I think we should take our time and make sure that the things that we are legislating or telling platforms to do are the right ones and are the most meaningful ones.
So on that note, I think somebody already sort of stole my kind of closing point, but I'll make it anyway. I think, going back to the topic of this panel in terms of trying to learn from this pandemic and prepare for the next crisis, it was pointed out that I think there was a very relatively small number, at the risk of exaggerating, people concerned with sort of terrorist use of the internet before the rise of ISIS, relatively little concern about election integrity prior to, and the impact of social media on elections prior to the 2016 US election and a wave of elections around that time in different places around the world, and relatively little concern with medical misinformation online before this pandemic. I want to close just with a sort of lightning round. If everybody could kind of try to think about what's the next thing that we should be thinking about and concerned about, what's over the horizon that companies and trust and safety teams in companies should be starting to think about now, so that hopefully we're better prepared and can integrate all of the kinds of approaches that everyone's been talking about already. So I'll one more time start with the same order we've been using and go back to Stephen.
Well, it's interesting because over the years, I've had the privilege of sitting down with trust and safety teams across many of our 30 members. And in the years ago, it was, how do we talk to parents? How do we relate to them? How do we respond to their concerns and needs? I would say the shift is, you've got to also now figure out how best to talk to teens and young people. And it's going to be a different conversation, different vocabulary, different concerns. But actually, in some ways, the hopeful side of it is, they'll be much more tech savvy than their parents.
All right, great. Erin, on to you.
I think I'll riff off of something that Spandy brought up, which is that I do increasingly hear from governments the buzzwords come up all the time and go, but right now algorithms is big. But I think also for a tech company, algorithm could mean literally almost anything. And so one thing we did in our working groups is break up algorithms into 3 out of 5 of our working groups. One is just about technical approaches. What is the actual AI and tooling related to algorithms? But the other questions are, how do you actually make transparency around algorithms? Bigger platforms have up to 2,000 plus algorithmic updates every year, if not many more than that, to their systems. And then also, what are the legal frameworks around that? When is it about PI? When we say algorithm, we're not really saying the algorithm that makes the Facebook logo blue. We're talking about search functionality. We're talking about ad optimization. We're talking about radicalized pathways of user-generated kind of pathways online. So I think if we say a buzzword like algorithm or even terrorist, I think others have mentioned the need to add the nuance and understanding behind those words, so that if that turns into policy or that turns into a push for removals, we actually understand the costs and benefits to that and what we're really talking about.
All right, so we have talk to teens and we have go beyond buzzwords. Danny, on to you.
I think you're going to see the pendulum swing the other way. I think we've seen the convergence of all of these conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns, et cetera, and the harms that they've caused and the havoc that they've wreaked. And I think we're seeing the tide shift the other direction. So I think we're going to see, and I'll be totally blunt about this, hopefully, right, but the tide swing the other direction in terms of antitrust action, in terms of privacy legislation, in terms of platform liability reform. All under the kind of broad umbrella of tech reform. The reassertion of government sovereignty as, to me, hopefully the next big thing. And so I think that's the next thing to watch for. But at the end of the day, that's also going to touch some of the largest market cap stocks in history and in the world. So, we all have to, these are conversations that will impact every single one of us, even if you're like me and you don't have a Facebook account. I'm sure the mutual fund in my retirement account still has exposure to that stock. And so if those margins change, these things will have global massive impacts. But I think, look, the next big thing is climate change and climate disinfo, and that's the all of these things will pale in comparison to that information battle and the results thereof. So it has to snap back. It has to swing the other way if we're all going to survive, frankly. And so I'm optimistic and hopeful that it will.
Rob.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we go into this mode where everybody's getting a little bit more comfortable on curation and control with consistency. So the idea that look, hosting content is not a binary choice. Yes, no, it's on blocking and removal, for instance. And I think that Svanti had spoken eloquently about that. I think the other thing is just that idea of control, which is do I have control over what I'm consuming as a user? Do I have control over where I'm placing ads? Do I have control over what I'm monetizing and promoting, e.g. sort of like algorithmic oversight? So, are these algorithms for good? And I really think that if we can sort of embrace those two C's and do it in a way that's consistent, so that's the third one, we will have a much more robust, bright digital ecosystem and be able to sort of contain the shadow, because let's be honest, the shadow is always going to be there, just given the amount of people and the amount of money that's there. It's just an unfortunate inevitability, but we have to work together to control the shadow.
Thanks. And Spandy, on to you for the final words.
Thanks. I mean, I said algorithmic accountability, but I actually think a big issue I see in the trust and safety space going forward is not a new one. It's one that's probably been swept to the side a little bit, which is that we've spent a lot of money, resources as companies, as civil society, focusing on the big markets in the world. But what about trust and safety for smaller markets, for other languages, for other, communities that don't always capture the headlines? We can fight disinformation as much as we want in the United States, but if the majority of a platform's users don't reap the benefits of those efforts, then that deficit is going to keep getting bigger and bigger. And when any of these issues that you all mentioned become the next big thing, it's not going to, that the harms that result to the majority of these users will continue to grow.
So thank you to all of our speakers. I think it was great because I asked kind of about the next problem to watch out for, but what I think we got was kind of avenues towards solutions and ones that actually work together and in concert. And that's I think an optimistic note for us to end on. So on behalf of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership and the Trust and Safety Professional Association, thank you everybody who joined us today. We'll make the recording of this video available on our websites through social media. Sign up, go to our websites to learn more about what we're doing. And we look forward to engaging with everybody moving forward as we think about ways that we can continue to enhance the practice of trust and safety across digital services and across the internet. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and hope everyone has a good rest of your respective days. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.